What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a little bit of news about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. Specifically, the developers, the Chinese Room, dropped a dev diary a couple days ago, breaking down combat, and some of that I thought was actually pretty interesting, so I wanted to kind of go over it and talk about it a little bit. As of right now, Bloodlines 2 is on track for release a little later this year, probably around summertime if I had to guess, but no official date. They've been sharing a ton of information, obviously, with this advanced combat and weapons dev diary, but to get the usual stuff out of the way, like many people, I am very apprehensive about this one. Its dev cycle has been a lot, frankly, for reasons that I assume most people are aware of now. But as I've explained here and there over the years, I'm seeing this through to the end. Even if the game is terrible, I've got to know how this pans out, frankly. So I'm hoping it's good, but I mean, it's an extremely uphill battle just to get to good at this point. So again, we'll see what happens. But from there, let's actually talk about this advanced combat and weapons dev diary. So first and foremost, I want to start out with a slight negative, because while I actually think most of this sounds decent to pretty solid, one thing I noticed from all their little GIFs playing on screen is that not a single attack that is actually meant to connect with a target seems to physically hit them. Now some attacks, like the Tremeur's basic attack, is not meant to. That's pretty obvious. They're all about blood magic, and it looks like their basic attack is a slight blood magic attack, which would make sense. But I noticed that all the other ones, like the Bruja, who are actually supposed to be physically hitting their target, don't seem to actually make contact ever, despite the hit going through. So while everything else looks pretty good, it was just kind of jarring. I don't like that at all. But from there, let's dive into some details. So the first thing they went over basically was basic attacks. These are apparently going to be clan specific, which was honestly a pretty nice little touch. If you're unaware, there are 4 clans that'll be playable: Tremere, Banu Hakim, Bruja, and Ventru, and each of them has their own flair to their basic attack. Bruja actually punch. Ventru are more like martial arts, whereas Banu is more of a claw motion, and then Tremere has their little blood magic attack that they will perform. So I thought that was a nice touch of differentiating just between the actual clan you're playing, even if you're going to get disciplines from other clans later on. Now they then go on to describe dashing and kick attacks. I thought this was interesting, but mostly because of the kicks. I mean, obviously dashing's a pretty standard ability. You'll be able to dodge out of the way or dodge towards enemies to get distance on them, but apparently at the end of a dash though, you'll be able to perform a kick, and they specifically mentioned that you actually have some variety here. There's a straightforward kick which will knock a single target back, but you could even potentially perform a roundhouse kick and knock back several enemies instead. And they mentioned that all of these attacks, including apparently things like disciplines, will see opponents able to resist attacks that you use over and over again, so there's going to be some diminishing return there and some incentive to mix things up, which makes a lot of sense, especially for more hardy enemies like Kindred, who aren't going to be exploded in a single hit. And they even show off some counters and attacks like that. Now from there, they go on to talk about telekinesis specifically. This is a power that obviously allows you to move things around, but it's more about what you can do with it in any given situation, being a bit creative. So you can use telekinesis on some enemies to pull them towards you or knock them away from you, and obviously using height to your advantage there. But what's more, the environment will have a whole host of different interactable objects. They show off a propane tank as an example. You can chuck those and have them explode alongside just other regular everyday stuff, but explosives are obviously the fun option there, doing the old Jedi force push. But it gets a lot more interesting when you start seeing it with other abilities. So apparently you'll be able to even pick up dropped enemy weapons with this, such as guns, so you can potentially use a vampiric discipline to make the enemies drop their guns, such as mass manipulation and taunt from the Bruja might do this, and then you could use telekinesis to pick all of those guns up and have them fire at other people, which certainly sounds pretty amusing. But then they went on to talk about ability combos and how those can be applied with things like telekinesis. For instance, you can actually use telekinesis to pick up explosive arrows and send them back at enemies as well, which I thought was funny. But they use a few more specific examples, like for instance, the Tremeur's blood curse can apparently be triggered from a distance with, it says a well-placed shot, so I assume they mean a gun there. But Ventru get an ability called mass manipulation, whereas the Bruja can then interact with that with their taunt ability, which will cause entire groups of enemies to disarm themselves, at which point you could potentially telekinesis them and then use those weapons that way, which sounded like some especially interesting combinations. They even mention that Tremere actually gets a form of like mark and recall from like Morrowind as an example. You can set a recall point and then teleport to it as a Tremere. Or Banu Hakim has an ability called Mute that effectively allows you to silence an area and thus make any combat there not trigger other enemies around you, which I thought was interesting. But it's really how these all combine that is probably going to make up most of the make or break moments for a lot of people in terms of combat, such as the Tremere using Cauldron of Blood to attract a bunch of enemies, only to set one of them up with a blood curse, which can then be triggered to cause them to explode and hit everything around them. At least as far as regular enemies go, because this is basically just ghouls. So it's probably worth a mention then that none of these characters it really shows off are in fact other kindred or vampires. So what those fights against more resilient enemies look like has, I would say, yet to be fully fleshed out, and they're probably saving that for later, but it does make me wonder just what those fights might actually be like. A few more things to talk about though. This game is going to have a decent representation of Thin Bloods, and Thin Bloods are known for their alchemy, which is expressed in game via various potions we will be able to use. A health potion, a mending elixir, a blood elixir, which will restore our blood points, allowing us to use our abilities more often, potence, which just increases the damage of our attacks, and then fortitude, straight up damage reduction. Pretty standard stuff there. I just wanted to mention here that I like the animations that they've shown off with this. Minimal HUD, which makes it look pretty clean overall, and honestly the fact that they're bringing in the Thin Bloods sort of alchemy and stuff into the actual game is nice, even if, yeah, it's a little video gamey. And then the last couple of things here, they mentioned that ghouls in particular can be targeted with the possession ability and then, forcibly moved off a building as an example, or any other number of scenarios you could think of with possession, I imagine. So that was fun. And then they ended this dev diary on the difficulty settings. So unsurprisingly, with the setting in particular, there are a lot of people that are going to be playing a game like this, not so much for the challenge of it, but rather just the experience and the story, as the World of Darkness is especially a TTRPG setting that is really more about the stories you create than mechanical complexity. So having a difficulty option there was never a surprise, but new information technically, so here it is. You'll be able to pick between easy, normal, or hard, though obviously we don't have any details about what that'll actually change at the moment, but worth knowing, I suppose. That, though, I think is pretty much going to wrap up this particular video. I just thought this was a neat read, so I wanted to share it with people. We haven't talked about Bloodlines 2 in a little bit, but it is technically slated for this year, provided there are no further delays or anything like that, which I doubt at this point. And to be honest, this is already looking a little better than I thought it would, to be blunt. But I will say, for me personally at this point, I really just need to see this entire game in motion, especially to see how things like the dialogue and stuff they've talked about previously pans out. Mostly because if you're unaware, their dialogue system is going to sort of react to you without actually showing up as a reaction. For instance, based on the way you talk to people, their dialogue will change, but it's not going to like notify you that that's different. And they gave some examples in previous dev diaries. So I'd like to kind of see some of that stuff actually working and what the exploration and how all this blends together. So I'm still coming at this with an open mind, and we'll see what ultimately happens with it when I finally review the thing upon its actual release. But for now, that's going to do it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.